Okay, so welcome to today's lecture. So it's our 23rd sessions, and we are going to start a series of three lectures on machine learning and AI. So if you look at the syllabus, it was originally going to be about statistics and data visualization, but I figured that given today's advancement in AI, I think we better spend more time on this topic. So for today, I'm going to start with giving you like an introduction and giving you the view of the evolution or history of AI from kind of rule-based algorithms to nowadays that we have a generative model. And for next week and the next 2 weeks, we are going to look at how machine learning and AI came to be used in computational biology, so that you kind of see the frontiers of the field. So the first kind of classic question is kind of what is AI? I tend, as a computational biology class, like we want to think of it simply as AI, like there are two words, like artificial and intelligence. So we want to make sure that first it's artificial, like it's not natural, it's not an animal, it's not a living being, but it's intelligent. Like it can compute something, it can predict something, it understands something. And when we think about what are the size of intelligence that computer programs or algorithms seems to understand something, it's similar to how humans measure intelligence. We want to measure in exams, we want to measure if we memorize something, can we recall certain piece of information or certain piece of theory. And when we analyze data, we want to be sure to recognize any pattern that we found in the data and try to generalize it to different biological systems or different patient cohorts. So that's like another side of intelligence. We can try to do some things, and when we fail, we learn to do it better. Like when we code and create errors, like we can fix it. The learning from trial and error is also another side of intelligence. Next would be the ability to create. You can write essays, you can draw pictures. That's also a sign that you have some intelligence, some understanding of the concepts of the things that you are creating. And the last of all would be very important for science, the ability to provide reason and to understand cause and effect. So by looking at these signs or measures of intelligence, you probably will realize that today's computers are breaking through each of these layers. If we go back, even the start of the internet era, we start to have websites, we start to have database. So we start to have computers and algorithms that can extract information, that can get the right web page, get the right entry in the database to show us. So computer has long known be able to memorize and deal with information. But lately, we start to see computers being better and better at pattern recognition. We give the computers enough image of a cell or of the patient. We can train the computers to understand the subtle patterns in the image that are useful for either diagnose a patient or identify the cell type. We start to be able to train the computer to recognize variation in colors in the pixel or the usage of words that we use. You might be familiar with this news from Google DeepMind almost 10 years ago, when we are able to train computers to learn from trial and error. The technique is called reinforcement learning. But basically, for many tasks like driving a car or playing games, it's not like you can create every possibility to train the computer. Because when the computer drives the drone, the environment can be different, the time of the day can be different, the obstacle can look different. There's no way that you can create observation or experiment that can cover every possibility. So we need to have algorithms that allow the computers to try to learn from its mistake over time. So that's another breakthrough that allows the computers to perform very amazing things. And one of one of the key aspects that drive modern day artificial intelligence is machine learning. So basically, it's the ability of the computer or the machine to learn. And to talk about machine learning, I want to take you back to the early days of computer programs. For example, search engine. Nowadays, when you run search engine, you have AI output. But if you recall back to your younger years, you might still remember where you type in the text in Google or Bing or Yahoo, and you get some web page. Some might match the things that you want, but some could be entirely different. If you have done some image processing software, like Photoshop, you probably have come across some feature like Magic Wand, where you can click on one pixel and it try to highlight for you other pixels that have the same colors or have the same intensity. So this allows you to separate the foreground object or the flower from the background that looks green. So this allows you to process the image, to edit the image much more easily. But these are not what people call AI generally, because the algorithm underneath is made by human. When you search on the internet in the past, basically the algorithm used the word that you type exactly as you type and try to search against the database of website or web page that use the same words. So it's just matching. For Magic Wand, the algorithm is just to start from the pixel that you click, and then try to propagate your selection to nearby pixel with similar hue, similar color or similar intensity. So it's an algorithm that humans fully describe what to do. But it works very well because you can apply it to different image. You can apply it to different search, and it works the same way. So the first era of computer intelligence is still governed by human knowledge, by man-made algorithms. But the problem is there are limitations of what we can describe as algorithm. If you want to create an AI that can diagnose COVID-19, if you recall back 5-6 years earlier, when we have thousands of patients every day, and we want a model of computer algorithms that can screen COVID-19 positive patients. There's no way that we can write an algorithm like Magic Wand that can describe whether this image contains a COVID-19 signature, because even humans cannot describe what the features should be for every COVID-19 patient. So this call for an evolution of the computer program that can optimize itself. If we can provide enough data, enough chain X-ray, with enough answer, maybe for PCR. We know that this patient has a COVID-19 from PCR. If we have enough pairs of input or chain X-ray image and the output or COVID-19 test result, can we train the computers to build these algorithms, these black box algorithms on its own? So that's the shift from man-made algorithms to making the computers learn from the data. And that's what people call machine learning. So we want the computers to be able to learn from the data without human having to specify what to do at every step. Next week, we're going to examine these two paradigms in machine learning. One is called supervised learning, which is the one that you are used to. When we have chain X-ray or when we have any data, and we have the answer that we want the computer to be able to predict, like cell type or treatment response, then we want to train the computer, we want to supervise the computer to make the right answer. So basically, we know the answer. We just don't know how to calculate score or calculate numbers that can predict the answer, but we know the answer. So that's supervised learning. But in biology, you might be surprised that most of the time when we do biological research, we are actually dealing with unsupervised learning, because the goal of research usually in biology is not to predict something. Those are for computational projects. But as a biologist, you want to understand the data. If I give you single cell omics data, the first question is, we want to know how many cell types are there in the data set. And that falls into unsupervised learning because in the beginning, you don't even know how many cell types are there, right? And you don't know what cell types are there. So we want computer program to be able to figure that out, how many cell types are in the data, what could be the cell, each cell type, what are the biomarkers for each cell type. We want to discover. So that will be the topic for next week. But in terms of the evolution of computer programs, so we start to develop ideas or algorithms that allow the computers to learn from the data. So I would kind of basically call this a second era of AI, where we start to have a machine learning model. But it's still very basic. These are most of them are before you were born. So for example, like in statistics class, you probably learn about some linear regression. So linear regression, you want to predict some score using each input, maybe the gene expression of different genes, and then multiply them with different coefficients. And you get the final score by summing all the weighted gene expression of other features together. In some situations, you might want to create a model that mimics human decision making. When you examine the animal or the patient, you might first ask, like, what's the age of the animal or the age of the patient? And depending on whether it's a young patient or young animal, like, you might have some concern about different type of health problem or phenotypes. But if it is an older animal or older patient, you will have a different idea of what would be the concerning phenotypes or problems. So this type of tree model mimic the decision-making process in human brain. We ask one question at a time, and depending on the answer, we either ask the next question or we come arrive at the conclusion. What happens? So in this example, let's say we are examining a patient. First, we ask, like, what's the age of the patient? If he or she is below 18, so it's a junior, maybe we want to examine obesity. We want to ask next about the weight. But if that patient is above 30, is an adult, we might want to check if he or she smokes, because that's not a problem for children, but maybe more of a problem for adults. So this kind of tree model make different questions based on the answers or based on the situation from the previous question. So you can keep asking more and more questions until you arrive at enough confidence to classify the cell type. If you ask, is gene A highly expressed or not expressed? And then you ask, is gene B highly expressed or not expressed? That can help you arrive at the cell type classification problem. Another classic algorithm is called a nearest neighbors algorithm. So basically, if you see a new transcriptomic data, when you want to classify the cell type, or if you want to classify the disease status for the new sample, one thing that you can ask is, can I compare this transcriptomic profile to other papers or the other database that have been published before? If the new transcription, if the new gene expression profile match to the expression profile of healthy patient or healthy animal, I'm inclined to classify the new sample as healthy. But if the new gene expression profile looks like cancer patient, then I'm inclined to classify the new patient as also as having cancer. So these are very classic, very simple model that you can understand by just describing a few sentences about what it does. People can make these algorithms a little bit more complex. For example, you might think that a linear model would be very weak. It doesn't have much power to describe non-linear or real-world relationships. But you might be able to combine multiple linear models that each explain different subpopulation of the patient or the animals. Combine them together. So for example, these are called ensemble approach. where you train the first model. The model can make some prediction correctly, but it still makes some errors. You can cover for these errors by training a second model that focuses on specifically on the errors made by the first model. So the second model doesn't have to be correct at everything. It just has to be correct on the errors of the first model. So the equation becomes narrower, easier to manage. The second model might make some good prediction, but still make some errors. And then we can train the third model to cover the errors from the second model. So you can keep cascading this process. And at the end, you have an ensemble or a group of models that together can, when you combine them together, they can make a very good prediction overall. Another situation called stacking is when you have different models. So we can imagine that a linear model can be appropriate for some system, but not all research questions. Tree model, might mirror human decision making, could be good for cell type classification, but might not be good for other settings. Nearest neighbors idea might be good when you have a large database underneath, but might not be good if your data are sparse. You have few data points. So some people have an idea that if you train these different models, each have different strengths and different weakness, you can combine them together into a new model that try to kind of reinforce the strengths for each model into the final prediction. So people, even though the classical model have limited capability, we still have ideas or techniques that combine many of them together to create a more advanced, more intelligent model. But there's a limitation. No matter how you combine models together, there will be a certain type of data that's so complex that you cannot hope to capture with any combination of linear models or any combination of tree models. That's the first problem, the first limitation. The second limitation is all these models still need human. We still need to pre-process the data into tables so that the model can understand. If you recall when you learn linear regression in statistics, the input must be a table. You cannot just put image into a linear regression. You cannot put a description of a gene into the linear regression. Humans still have to be the ones who turns non-numerical data into numerical data. So that's the limitation of another limitation of machine learning, of classical machine learning. So that drove people to try to solve this problem. How can we make computers first able to fit complex patterns and also able to extract information from data, from image data, in the same level as human. So people call this capability representation learning. So we want the computer to be able to learn how to represent data, how to represent a description of a gene with numbers, how to represent the image with numbers. Because we realize that we can turn non-numerical data into numbers, but if you do it in the wrong way, or in a very naive way, it's not useful. We can change each word in the dictionary into numbers, like man into 1, woman into 2, boy into 3, girls into 4. But it doesn't help the prediction. You don't get any relationship that man and woman are both about human, but different gender. You cannot tell anything about that from 1 and 2. You cannot tell that man and boy have the same gender, but different age from 1 and 3. So these kind of naive representation, turning data into numbers, even though you can run machine learning on it, it's not gonna be able to predict anything because there's no information in those numbers. Similarly, when you look at image, with human eyes, you can probably tell that this looks like a map. Has the city, there's a grid of streets, and also this might be a large river, and this is a bridge. But if you just put in the intensity, from 0 to 255, from black to white, into the computers, as it is, this doesn't mean much to predict anything from the data. So people thought about what would be a good way to represent this raw data, raw observation. So basically, we want numerical representation that somehow kind of keep the key characteristic or key information about the data. And this can have different meanings. If you want to classify cell type, you probably want to select genes that are important for cell type. If you want to predict drug response, you probably want to collect maybe the phenotype or the genomic profile of the patient or the animal to predict the response to the treatment or the drugs. If you want to reconstruct high resolution fluorescence image, you probably need some information from the image. And when we perform dimensionality reduction, like when we analyze single cell data, we learn that in order to get a good visualization of single cell data, we want to preserve cells that have similar omics profile. We want to show them next to each other on the screen. Cells that have different omics profile, we want to show them as being far apart on the screen. So the key characteristics that needs to be preserved in the case of dimensionality reduction is the similarity or the distance between samples. So representation can have different requirements and different meanings depending on your purpose, what you want to do with the data. In the image processing lecture, like we talked about how we can extract detail, extract information from the image with this kind of kernel matrix product. So people want the computers to be able to perform this mathematical calculation, but try to identify this kernel themselves. We talked a little bit about convolutional neural networks in that lecture. That when humans have no idea what numbers to apply in order to classify the cell type or classify the organelle, we ask the computer to look at a lot of data, a lot of image, and try to come up with the numbers in the kernel that allow them to classify cell type or classify the organelles or cellular component. So this is like the third generation of AI. Like we go from the first generation with human-based algorithms to second generation where we ask the model to learn from the data, but we feel restricted in terms of the model. So we only have linear model, we have tree model, we have limited capability to learn from raw data. But in the third generation of AI, we start to be able to train computers to deal with the raw observation, deal with the raw image, deal with the raw text. And we talked a little bit about this process before. And we found that computer was very successful with how to understand objects in the image using convolutional kernels. So we saw how we can train computers to process raw image data to get to the classification or information that humans can understand. So today I'm going to add a little bit more about representation, but from the perspective of language. So when we think about how computers can understand the description of a gene. So the description of a gene is based, let's say it's based on English. So there are many words in the English language. And we want the computer to understand each word. How do we turn a single word into numbers? One of the easiest way to imagine this process is if you have to explain the meaning of king to someone who doesn't know English. You have to tell that person that king is a human, is a ruler of a nation. So he has a certain jobs, very specific jobs. Kings may tend to have a lot of money, so that can be a factor, an aspect of a king. And king is a male, it's not female, that would be queen. So when you explain a single word, there are many aspects that you need to describe about that word. So what we hope the computer will be able to do is the computer should be able to turn a single word into a vector, each a vector with many dimensions, many numbers, and we hope that each column of this vector convey a different aspect of the word king. For example, king compared to man and woman, king might have a higher social status and more money, more prestige. So king differs from man and woman in that aspect. But all three words describe human. So from the perspective of being about human, they are all equal. But in terms of gender, king and man are of the same gender, and women are of different gender. So we hope that we can train computers to extract these kind of vectors for each word that can capture the meanings or the way that humans use this word. But how? How can we train the computer to do that? Some of you might have read some of these online already, but basically we don't want to interfere too much with the learning process. Imagine that when we deal with image, we are not telling the computer to look at certain region. We ask the computer to scan over the entire image. We ask the computer to try different kernels. We are not controlling the computers. The same thing applies when we want to train the computer to understand human language. We don't want to enforce a lot of constraint, like a lot of knowledge. Otherwise, we go back to the first era, where humans still have to make algorithms. Humans still have to make rules. So the idea is that we have so many information about language online. We have Wikipedia, we have website, we have ebooks. So we can ask the computer to try to create this mapping from one word to a vector by themselves with some guidance. And that guidance is if I take out one of the words in the sentence, let's say the sentence is the cat sat on the bed. If I take out the word sat and I give the computer the cat on the, if the computers, the algorithms, are able to understand the right representation, the right numbers, the right vectors for the word the word cat, the word on, it should be able to realize that the missing verb is sat, because sat, the cat can sat, and sat is followed by on. So there are clues in the grammar, in the meaning, that if the computer understands, get the right vectors, it should be able to use those vectors to predict that the missing word is sat. And this is done over all the words that are on the internet. They are on the ebooks. So the computer has a lot of sentences that human wrote to learn the association between different words in the English language. So this is done with minimal human intervention. We don't tell this is a verb, we don't tell this is a noun. We just give the computer many sentences and ask the computer to come up with this process of mapping words to numbers and use those numbers to make prediction. And if it can get it right, that means it's understanding somehow human language. So you might be curious, how do we confirm that the computer understands human language by doing this? So once we can transform each word into the vector, we can do dimensionality reduction, like the way we use for single set. We can imagine that each column is an expression of a gene. So the cat has a certain gene expression, kitten has a certain gene expression, dog has a certain gene expression. So we can visualize the similarity and the location of these words on two dimensions, like how we visualize omics data. And people found that once we train these algorithms with enough sentence from English language, the computers learns to place words like houses, which is not a living thing, away from living animal. And the computer understands that kitten and cat are more closely related than between cat and dog, because kitten is a young cat. So we start to see that it understands this pattern. Also, for relationships that change gender, like man and woman, or king and queen. People found that with enough training, the computer actually learned that if you want to change a man to a woman in the sentence, it has the same effect as changing from king to queen in the sentence. So basically, from enough sentence that human wrote, these type of algorithms can understand that the change in gender is the same between man and woman and between king and queen. So by seeing these patterns, scientists or an engineers can realize that this type of AI can start to understand human language. And when we saw the AlphaFold 2 architecture briefly during the protein and RNA structure class, we saw this type of diagram where as a human we put in one protein, an input sequence, this amino acid sequence. The algorithms perform multiple sequence alignment against known proteins and put this information inside the model. So all these part on the right hand side with the arrow, these are inside the machine learning model. And inside the model, it has to transform your amino acid sequence into numbers, because anything that are calculated inside the computers are numbers. So it's the same idea. We saw how convolutional neural networks can transform image into numbers. Now we see how language model can transform words into numbers. In biology, we can transform biological concept, we can transform amino acid sequence, nucleotide sequence into numbers using similar ideas. So this is the new capability that we have from machine learning. Now we are able to learn to use raw information without human intervention. But there's still a question of, can the model fit every pattern? Can it fit something that linear model, tree model cannot fit? And you might have heard the term artificial neural networks before. But you might be surprised to know that this model actually exists since 1940. So the idea of the artificial neural networks, where we mimic the neural system inside the animal, where we have a lot of neuron cells that send signal to each other as a network. So inside the computers, we also imagine that if we have enough computational units and we connect them together as a network, we should be able to derive intelligence the same way that our body, an animal, derive intelligence from the neural network. So when people design the artificial neural network architecture, you can imagine that each of these nodes will act like a neuron. And a neuron is actually pretty simple. You have signals coming to on the dead drive, which might come from multiple neurons before. So you have multiple input. And these neuron cells have to have gene expression signaling pathways to activate the signal. And if the activation is high enough, there will be some electrical signal and chemical signal that got sent to the next neuron. So we mimic this process by combining the input from multiple neurons using a linear combination. So it's very simple. But the activation, whether the signal is high enough, we apply what's called activation function, which looks like this, very simple. If the signal is low, there's no activation. No signal is passed. But if the signal is high, that signal is sent to the next neuron. Or we can do a sigmoid model where if the signal is low, then we send nothing. If the signal is intermediate, then we send the signal. But if the signal is high, then there's a saturation of signal. So these are simple models. We combine input from earlier neurons with linear function, and then we take this simple activation of signals to feed to the next neuron in the networks. So just to show you in more detail, the concept of activation function, if there is no signal, then no signal will be sent, or very weak signal will be sent. If we have high signal, we can either saturate or we can send higher and higher signal. So these are very simple idea. But the powerful thing is going back 20, 30, 40 years, mathematicians can already prove that if you have this kind of a network structure, you have artificial neurons, and you have this kind of calculation, where you have this activation function before sending the signal to the next layer. Mathematicians prove, going back in 1989, that if you have these neural networks, it can fit, it can capture any mathematical function. So basically, in a layman language, artificial neural networks is a universal function. You can fit anything, you can fit any relationship if you have enough data. So basically, now we have two ingredients. Like we have ways to train computers to understand raw data. And we have artificial neural networks that in theory can fit anything. So if we combine these two together, then we have AI that can understand human data and can understand any patterns inside the data. So there was a reason why we didn't have this back in 1989. We only have this nowadays. And that is because of two things. So let me take you back to 10 years ago, about 2015. So back then there was a competition among computer engineers called ImageNet. It's called ImageNet because it's a competition about image data, and we use that to build neural networks. So we call it ImageNet. So around that time, 2010 to 2015, we start to have the internet. People start to have digital camera. So we start to have digital data, image in digital form. Before that, we have data, we have photos like in print. You cannot train any model on printed photos. You need them in digital form. So internet is the first activator of modern AI. You have to have everything converted to digital, and everything needs to be connected together to create the database. But at the same time, people start to be able to train more larger and larger artificial neural networks because of the use of graphical processing unit. So some of you probably play computer games. So back then, people already use graphical processing unit to play games, but we haven't used it in science back then at that time yet. But then people realize that when you play video games on the computers, when you have graphics that change every maybe 60 frames or 120 frames per second, you have to update millions of pixels on the screen. So basically, a GPU is very good at making small changes, millions of locations at once. And that's useful for artificial neural networks because inside the model, there are so many parameters. Every edge that you see in this image is a parameter, is a coefficient that needs to be updated. So if you compare like to the usual linear regression, if you have 5 input, like you have 5 coefficients and the intersect, so you only fit 6 parameters. But in a neural network, you might start with 4 input, but you can have a million parameters. So basically, you have to calculate the change in millions numbers at once. And that's not something that CPU is good at. Like your CPU probably have at most 8 cores. Like it can only do 8 things at once. But in the neural networks, you have to update a million numbers at once. So people realize that this is perfect for graphical processing unit. You, instead of updating the pixels, you can update the weights or the coefficients in the neural network instead. So we start to see more use of GPU in science, and we start to be able to train deeper and deeper neural networks from 8 layers to 20 to 150. And what people found at the time was that when you have a large enough neural network, so you can imagine like evolution from small animal like with only 8 layers of neurons to larger animal with more complex neural network with 150 layers of neurons. We have more intelligence in animal with larger brain, with larger neural networks. And we found the same thing with computers. Algorithms start to be able to classify what objects can be seen in the image at a lower error rate than humans. So people found, for the first time, we found that when we have enough computational power, artificial neural networks can actually reach human level intelligence. So nowadays, every time that you see the term deep learning, is called deep learning because it's a machine learning for a deep neural network. So when you have 1 million parameters, 1 billion parameters, you have 100 layers of neurons, you have 1,000 layers of neurons, like you have very large model. You need a different algorithms, different ways to train the model. Because if you think back to your statistics class, if you have 5 parameters, you probably need maybe 50 samples. You need more sample than your parameters, much more. But when you have a billion, like 7 billion parameters language model, do you really have 70 billion training data? No, right? So engineers have to come up with different techniques to train this network. So they develop a new field. Instead of machine learning, it becomes a specialized technique for deep neural network called deep learning. And that is the third generation of AI, where we start to have models that can learn and utilize information or embedding from raw data. So let me conclude this third generation with this example, where a computer book, an AI, a computer program, can look at the X-ray image and can write the report. Imagine what the model has to be able to do to transform this image into the report. First, it has to use convolution, like the kernels that we saw in image processing lecture, to extract information from the image. Maybe the size of the heart, maybe the size of the lung, maybe the location of the opacity or the region in the image. It has to understand image, turning image into numbers. And in the middle somewhere, it has to be able to turn the numbers that represent image, concept in the image, into numbers that represent the topic of a sentence, because it's going to now generate the report. Report can be thought of as sentences. So the model first have to be able to transform numbers representing features or objects in the image to a topic of a sentence in the report. And for each sentence, the model has to be able to transform that topic into individual words that should be put in that sentence. If the model wants to talk about the heart, it has to output heart size is normal to convey that in this image, the characteristic about the heart looks normal. And in this paper in particular, it's even more powerful because when you want the AI to produce report, written report from image, you probably want to know as well where in the image that the model used to create this sentence. When the model says heart size is normal, does it look at the heart? It has to look at the heart to say that the heart size is normal. So in some advanced model, there's even a mix of numbers that represent word to numbers that represent image together to understand if the image corresponds to certain words or not. So this kind of this summarize the capability of the third generation of AI that can understand everything in the world as numbers. It can understand image and text, even biological data as numbers, and use those numbers inside for the calculation that can transform one data type to another. Another good example of the third generation capability is robots. If you want the robots to be able to follow your instruction, let's say move the banana to number 3. When you put that instruction, the robot using camera has to be able to identify the banana. It has to recognize that yellow object is a banana. So it's the image to numbers. And then the model has to understand What do you mean by number 3? Because on the table, these are written number 3. It's not there is no concept of object 3. It has to understand that 3 means the written number 3 on the table. And it has to understand that move is to use its arm to bring the banana to number 3. So it has to understand all these different aspects of the information, transform them into numbers, and calculate inside its own CPU or GPU to be able to do that. In this example, it's even more interesting. The instruction is move the strawberry to the right bowl. It doesn't say which bowl, it says the correct bowl. So the computer has to understand that the word correct means that the bowl should contain the same object as the strawberry that is moving in. So it has to understand human language. Otherwise, you have to say that move the strawberry to the middle bowl. But you can just say correct bowl and it understands what correct means in human language. So that's the third generation. But nowadays, this is already so advanced, but nowadays we are in the 4th generation. So lucky or maybe not lucky for you, that you have to work with very advanced AI. So now we are in the era of generative and foundational model. We're going to talk more about this in the next 2 lectures, but for today I'm going to give you an overview of what generative AI is. And we can talk more later. So generative AI is the ability to create something that it hasn't seen before, like to transform regular image into a different style. Like it's something that no one has done, but it has to be able to create, or to mimic real human being, to move the mouth, to mimic the sound, and to generate these new contents that no one has seen before. So language model is a good example of that. When it writes any response to you, those are all new. Those are not copied from any books. Those are not copied from any database. It's all responses are entirely new, generated like when it's chatting with you. So why do we classify this kind of 4th generation as very important? What we want to think compared to everything we learned about AI and machine learning before. Everything we learned about AI and machine learning before is in the discriminative domain. We only train the model to separate things, to classify things, to predict things. And if you imagine that you have, let's say, single cell data, right, and you visualize it. If you want to classify cell type, what you want the model to do is just to find this dashed line. If the model can identify this dashed line, it can classify the cell type. It doesn't have to understand anything else about the data. It doesn't have to know if which genes are highly expressed and how variable are the cell types. It only needs to identify this dashed line. And some variation of this dashed line can still work. So it's a very simple question to discriminate. But for a generative model, if you want the model to generate a new cells with a realistic gene expression, the model has to understand everything about gene expression data. It cannot just mix random numbers together and hope to create a realistic gene expression profile. Another way to think about it is this example. If I ask you which banknote is fake, you can tell easily that this is fake. But if I want you to draw a realistic banknote that doesn't exist in the world, but if you ask someone to edit, he or she might be convinced that it's real. It's much more difficult. So we imagine that with generative model is able to understand the distribution of the data, is able to produce realistic data. So maybe it understands the mechanism behind the data. And if we want to compare a generative model to what we saw in the 3rd generation, it's actually very related. When we talk about the ability of the model to look at the observation, like the raw data, and create numbers, like we call that process representation learning. So we have a model that can look at the data and create good numbers that capture the information in the data. What we are doing with generative model is the opposite. We start with some constraint, like we want a certain cell type, we want a certain type of image, and we want the model to create a new data from that description. So you can think of generative model as the inverse of the third generation representation method. But it's much more difficult. You have in the third generation you have real data and you compress it, you transform it into numbers. The model doesn't have to generate anything new. But the generative AI, it has to create data that no one has measured before. So in the next two lectures, we're going to talk about how we can make generative AI. How do we guide or how do we train such process? And what can we do with it in biology? But for now, I want you to be able to appreciate that when we have a generative AI, it's not just about generation. What we want from generative AI is also the ability to control the generation process. For example, let's take this simple image example. Let's say you have a photos of real person. You can probably train a model to generate a random person, a synthetic person. But that doesn't help you understand anything about a person or anything about the image of a person. What will help you understand about the data is if you can tell the model to make this person smile more, and the model is able to create a person with wider smile. And if you ask the model to make this person stop smiling, and the model knows what to do, this helps you understand. If you imagine this as single cell or omics data, if you can ask the model to add the effect of a drug, and the model can create a new gene expression for you with the effect of the drug. Or if you ask the model to remove a confounding factor, like a cell type, a cell line, from the omics data, and the model can do that. Basically, you can understand what would happen if you analyze a new cell line. What would happen if you treat the cell with the drug. So the ability to control, to interpret the generative process is what we actually want from generative model, from the perspective of research science. It's cool, right? When you want to make these pictures more male, more masculine, the model knows to add the mustache. But if you ask the model to make this person less male, the model knows to make the shape of the eye and maybe put some lipstick on. So this means that the model understands what human means in terms of gender, what the human means in terms of the emotion. So we can create new data that mimic the effect of what we want to study. And nowadays, we can generate very realistic data using generative AI. So for example, in radiology, if you want to study different type of image, MRI, CT, not every hospital has enough patients or has enough resource to create these image to train model or to study. But you can train generative AI on large hospital with thousands of patients, 100,000 of patients. And then the model can generate new synthetic MRI, synthetic CT that can be used to study the anatomy of human, to understand the change caused by the disease, to train new model. And people expect that in the future, because we have limited resource to generate real observation, to make measurement, we are going to rely more and more on synthetic data generated by generative AI to supplement our research, our study. And in this example, it's a very cool use of generative AI. So basically, the paper want to understand the progression of Alzheimer's disease. But usually for any kind of disease, the patient wouldn't know that he or she has the disease until he or she displays the symptoms. But at that point, you lose the opportunity to understand the progression of the disease. You only see the patient when he or she already had it. But in terms of research, we want to know the progression when he or she was still healthy. What changed inside the brain? What changed inside the cells that caused the Alzheimer's? Or when the patient responds well to disease, to treatment. Sorry. When the patient responds well to treatment, we want to know what molecular change occur inside the cells to make the patient respond well to treatment. But you cannot just get brain sample or tissue sample from the patient every month, every week, because that's kind of invasive. So this study showcased an idea that if you have enough data from patients, maybe from the past, or from patients who already passed away, you train a generative model that can generate realistic gene expression data for the patient's brain. And we use that model to impute the missing time point in the patient cohort. So instead of not being able to see this progression, we have the generative models that can predict that this patient probably the gene expression probably changed along this trajectory until he or she has Alzheimer's. And by using AI to impute the data, now we have observation that we wouldn't have otherwise. And we can follow up with the usual biostatic analysis that we know very well to understand biomarkers, to get the pathways that are affected in the patients. And then we can validate these biomarkers in real data, in real cell culture. And many papers start to see that knowledge that are imputed by the AI oftentimes can lead to real discovery. So if you have to wait to get enough data from the patient, it might take a very long time, or it might be invasive to the patient. But with generative AI, you can impute the data, and you can analyze the data to get candidate biomarker, candidate treatment that you can validate in future research. In another example, so when you analyze single cell omics, we have multiple cell types. Sometimes we have multiple cell states. Some cells are still in stem cells, and some cells already differentiate. We want to know, when we analyze single cell data, we want to understand gene expression profile separate by cell type, separate by cell state. But because the data has a mix of cell type and cell state, and we actually have no label when we have single cell data, all cells look the same, except their gene expression. So people use generative model to try to disentangle factors that influence gene expression. So for example, we have a single cell data, this is our real observation. We want to use this data to train a generative model that can also generate single cell omics data. So the hope is, if the model can generate realistic single cell data, that means the model probably understands how genes are expressed inside the cell. And if you recall this example, where we want to be able to understand each effect by asking the model to generate data that has certain effects, more small or more masculine. In the case of single cell, we're going to ask the model to generate realistic single cell measurement when we pick a specific cell type, when we pick a certain treatment, or when we pick a certain development stage. So we put in these conditions, these different colors, designate different cell type, different dosage of the drug, different development stage of the cell. If the model can take in these conditions and generate realistic single cell data, that means the model understands how cell type dictate gene expression, how drug treatment affect gene expression, how cell development stage affect gene expression. And we can use the model, similar to this example, to understand what would be the impact of more treatment, like if we increase the dose, if we decrease the dose, if we change the gene, if we change the cell to a different type, what would happen to the gene expression? And then we can identify the genes that the model predict to be higher or lower as biomarkers. So nowadays, people are trying to use generative AI to understand complex omics data by basically dissociating all the individual factors and put it as an input to the model to control the generation process. And if we can do that, we can understand impact from different factors. We're going to talk more about this in the next two lectures more closely. Okay, so today, so just to summarize, so today we want to introduce like the concept of machine learning and AI, and we learned that in the early AI, it's still governed by human knowledge. We have to write programs, we have to write all the rules to tell the computers what to do. So it's already intelligent, right? It can be applied to every computer, but it's still driven by human knowledge. In the second era, we want the model to learn from the data themselves. Like we have enough X-ray image, we have enough fluorescence image, we have enough omic data. Can we ask the computer to learn the relationship between omics data and phenotype themselves without human having to say which gene to calculate? That's the second part. And then once we have more and more complex data, we start to realize that we want the model to be able to extract the information, the useful information from the raw data, from the raw image, and from the language themselves. And that's the representation learning capability of the AI. And in the last generation, which we are using nowadays, is the ability to create, the ability to generate new observation subject to our control, more treatment or change the disease state. What would the observation be? And we can use that capability to understand more about the biological system. So that's everything that I want to cover today.